The morning of January 24th, 1942, dawned clear and cold over Mangaladon Airfield in Burma. Second Lieutenant Philip Adair of the American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers, stood beside his Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, running through his pre-flight checks with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 months of brutal aerial combat. At 24 years old, Adair was lean and quiet, a former pursuit pilot from the U.S. Army Air Corps who had resigned his commission in the spring of 1941 to join Claire Chennault's mercenary fighter group in China. Like the other AVG pilots, he'd been lured by the promise of $600 a month, nearly 3 times his Army pay, plus a $500 bonus for every Japanese aircraft destroyed. But by January 1942, after Pearl Harbor had transformed America's unofficial war in China into a very official one, the money seemed less important than simple survival. The P-40 Warhawk wasn't the most advanced fighter in the world. Its Allison V1710 engine gave it a top speed of about 360 miles per hour, respectable but not exceptional. It couldn't climb as quickly as the Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, or turn as tightly as the nimble Mitsubishi A6M0. The P-40's cockpit was cramped, visibility was limited by the long nose, and the aircraft had a tendency to overheat in the tropical climate of Southeast Asia. But Chennault had taught his pilots to exploit the Warhawk's strengths, its rugged construction, heavy armament of 650 caliber Browning machine guns, and superior diving speed. The Flying Tigers didn't dogfight with Japanese fighters. They dove from altitude, made slashing attacks with their machine guns blazing, and dove away again before the enemy could respond. "Hit and run," Chennault preached. "Never try to turn with a zero." Adair had learned these lessons well. In his first engagements over Kunming and Rangoon, he'd followed Chennault's tactics religiously, scoring 2 confirmed victories and earning a reputation as a solid, dependable pilot who didn't take unnecessary risks. That reputation was about to be tested in ways no one could have imagined. Part 2. The situation in Burma. By late January 1942, the situation in Burma was deteriorating rapidly. The Japanese army had invaded from Thailand on December 11, 1941, and was pushing northward with overwhelming force. Rangoon, Burma's capital and principal port, was under constant air attack. The city was critical to the Allied war effort. It was the southern terminus of the Burma Road, the vital supply route that connected British-controlled Burma to nationalist China, keeping Chinese forces supplied in their grinding war against Japan. The defense of Burma fell primarily to British Commonwealth forces, but they were undermanned, undersupplied, and outgunned. In the air, the Royal Air Force squadrons had been mauled in the opening weeks of the campaign. That's where the Flying Tigers came in. The AVG's 1st and 2nd Pursuit Squadrons had been sent south from their base in Kunming, China, to help defend Rangoon. Operating from Mangaladon Airfield just north of the city, they faced impossible odds. The Japanese Army Air Force and Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service could send dozens of bombers and fighters on each raid, while the AVG typically scrambled with perhaps a dozen P-40s. On good days. The early warning system was primitive at best. British and Burmese spotters positioned in the jungle would telephone warnings when they heard Japanese aircraft approaching, giving the pilots perhaps 30 minutes notice, just enough time to scramble, climb to altitude, and position themselves for Chennault's preferred boom and zoom attacks. On January 23, the day before Adair's fateful encounter, the Flying Tigers had shot down 18 Japanese aircraft over Rangoon for the loss of 3 P-40s. It was a tactical victory, but everyone knew it was unsustainable. The Japanese could replace their losses. The AVG could not. Part 3. The Morning Mission. The alert came at 10:47 a.m. on January 24. The field telephone rang in the operations shack, and the duty officer grabbed it, listened for 10 seconds, then ran outside shouting, "Scramble! Scramble! Heavy raid inbound from the southeast!" Pilots sprinted from the dispersal area toward their aircraft, Ground crews were already pulling the engine covers off the P-40s and priming the Allison engines. Adair reached his aircraft, number 77, with a distinctive shark mouth painted on the nose that identified all Flying Tiger P-40s, and vaulted into the cockpit. The Allison engine caught with a roar on the second try, blue exhaust smoke puffing from the stacks. All around the field, 12 P-40s were coming to life, their propellers spinning into transparent discs. Squadron leader Robert H. Tadpole Smith would lead the formation today, with orders to intercept the incoming raid at 20,000 feet. Adair ran through his checklist with practice speed. Oil pressure good, fuel mixture rich, magnetos checked, gun sight on, gun camera armed. The 650 caliber Browning machine guns in the P-40's wings and nose carried about 235 rounds per gun, roughly 20 seconds of firing time if he held the trigger down continuously. Every burst had to count. At 10:53, Smith's P-40 began rolling down the dirt runway, followed at 5-second intervals by the rest of the squadron. Adair advanced his throttle, and the Warhawk accelerated, the tail coming up as he gained speed. At 90 miles per hour, he eased back on the stick, and the P-40 lifted into the air, landing gear retracting with a thump. The 12 fighters formed up in loose pairs, climbing toward the southeast. Below them, Rangoon spread out along the Rangoon River, a city of golden pagodas in British colonial buildings, now scarred by bomb craters and fires from previous raids. At 15,000 feet, still climbing, someone's voice crackled over the radio. "Bogies! Bogies at 2 o'clock high! Looks like Sally's with escort!" Adair squinted into the bright tropical sky, scanning the area his wingman had indicated. Then he saw them. A formation of twin-engine bombers at about 22,000 feet, glinting like silver fish in the sunlight. He counted quickly. 12 bombers, probably Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally heavy bombers, arranged in a tight defensive formation. And above them, weaving back and forth like protective wolves, were the fighters. Small, nimble shapes that could only be Nakajima Ki-27 Nate fighters, or possibly the newer Ki-43 Oscars. "Tally-ho!" Smith's voice came through the radio. "We'll take the bombers on the first pass. Stay in pairs, make your run, and dive away. Don't stick around for a second pass unless you're sure you can get in and out clean." The P-40s continued climbing, trying to gain altitude advantage. This was the critical phase. If they could position themselves above the Japanese formation, they could dive down with tremendous speed, fire their machine guns, and zoom away before the escort fighters could react. But if they had to climb into the attack, they'd be sitting ducks for the more maneuverable Japanese fighters. At 19,000 feet, Smith waggled his wings and began his diving attack. The P-40s rolled over and plunged toward the bomber formation, diving at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. Adair followed his section leader, keeping his eyes locked on one of the Sally bombers as it grew larger in his gun sight. At 600 yards, he pressed the trigger. The P-40 shuddered as all 6 machine guns opened fire, tracers arcing out toward the bomber. He walked his fire across the Sally's right wing and fuselage, seeing pieces fly off the aircraft. Return fire sparkled from the bomber's defensive gun positions. The Sally carried up to 5 7.7mm machine guns, and the gunners were trained and determined. Something clanged against Adair's aircraft. A hit, but nothing critical. He held his dive, still firing, until he was at 300 yards, then released the trigger and pulled back hard on the stick. The P-40 groaned under the G-forces as it bottomed out of the dive at 14,000 feet. Behind him, the Sally bomber was trailing smoke, one engine clearly dead, but still flying. Around the sky, chaos erupted as the other P-40s made their attacks and the Japanese fighters dove to intercept. "Break right! Break right!" someone shouted over the radio. Adair snapped his head around and saw a Ki-43 Oscar diving toward him, its twin 12.7mm machine guns winking as they fired. He hauled the P-40 into a hard right turn, not trying to outturn the Japanese fighter, just to spoil its aim, then rolled and dove away, using the Warhawk's superior diving speed to escape. The Oscar tried to follow, but quickly fell behind. Adair leveled out at 10,000 feet and looked around, trying to assess the situation. Part 5. Separated from the pack. The sky that had been full of aircraft 30 seconds ago now seemed almost empty. The bomber formation had scattered, with several sallies trailing smoke as they limped toward home. The P-40s had likewise dispersed, each pilot diving away after his attack run according to Chenault's tactics. Adair scanned the sky, looking for his wingman, but saw no friendly aircraft nearby. This wasn't unusual. After a high-speed engagement, it could take several minutes for a squadron to reform. The standard procedure was to head back toward Mangaladon at low altitude and regroup there. He nosed the P-40 toward the northwest, staying low at 8,000 feet, where the P-40's engine performed better in the dense air. His fuel gauge showed he'd burned through about a quarter of his fuel in the climb and combat. Plenty left to get home. That's when he saw them. At first, he thought they were more P-40s, a group of aircraft in loose formation, heading roughly the same direction he was. But something about their silhouette was wrong. The wings were too straight, the fuselages too slender. Adair's blood went cold. They were Japanese. A formation of 10 Ki-43 Oscar fighters, probably part of the escort that had been covering the bombers. And from their altitude and position, it was clear they'd spotted him. The Oscars began turning toward him, spreading out as they prepared to attack. Adair's mind raced through his options. He was alone, outnumbered 10-1, and at least 50 miles from Mangaladon Airfield. The Oscars were faster in level flight and could outclimb and outturn his P-40. Running was pointless. They'd catch him before he made it halfway home. Every instinct Chenault had drilled into the flying tigers screamed at him to dive away, use his speed to escape. But with 10 fighters positioned to cut off any escape route, that tactic wouldn't work. If he dove, some of them would dive with him, and even if he could outrun the first few, the others would be waiting when he had to level out. For a brief moment, Adair considered bailing out. He could roll the P-40 inverted, jettison the canopy, and drop into the Burmese jungle below. But the jungle was controlled by Japanese ground forces, and any Allied pilot captured by the Japanese could expect brutal treatment, if he survived the parachute landing in the dense canopy. Then, in a flash of clarity born from desperation, Adair made a decision that went against every tactical principle he'd been taught. Instead of running, he would attack. Part 6. The Audacious Decision. The logic, such as it was, went like this. The Japanese pilots expected him to run. They were positioning themselves to intercept his escape, spreading out to cover all possible directions he might flee. What they wouldn't expect was for a single P-40 to deliberately charge into their formation. Adair knew the P-40's strengths. It was ruggedly built with armor plating behind the pilot's seat and a self-sealing fuel tank that could take considerable punishment. Its 6 50 caliber machine guns delivered tremendous firepower, far more than the Oscar's twin 12.7mm guns. And while the P-40 couldn't turn with an Oscar, it could take a hit and keep flying, whereas the lightweight Oscar was notoriously fragile. Most importantly, Adair had about 15 seconds before the Japanese fighters completed their encirclement. 15 seconds to do something so unexpected, so audacious, that it might buy him the chaos and confusion he needed to survive. He shoved the throttle forward to maximum power and pointed the P-40's nose directly at the nearest Oscar. The Japanese pilot, seeing the P-40 charging toward him, seemed to hesitate for just a moment, probably radioing to his flight leader, trying to understand what this crazy American was doing. That moment of hesitation was all Adair needed. At 800 yards, Adair opened fire. All 6 machine guns hammered, and he could see his tracers reaching out toward the Oscar. The Japanese pilot broke left, trying to turn inside Adair's attack, but Adair had anticipated this. He led the turn, walking his fire across the Oscar's flight path. Strikes sparkled along the Oscar's fuselage and wing root. Suddenly, the Japanese fighter shuddered and pieces of its engine cowling flew off. Black smoke poured from the engine and the Oscar rolled over and began spinning toward the jungle below. Part 7. Into the Maelstrom. 1 down, 9 to go. But Adair had no time to celebrate or even confirm the kill. The remaining 9 Oscars were reacting now, abandoning their encirclement pattern and converging on him from multiple directions. Tracers streaked past his canopy, bright lines of death passing within feet of his cockpit. Instead of diving away, Adair did something even more counterintuitive. He pulled up into a steep climbing turn, bleeding off speed but gaining altitude. The Oscars, lighter and more nimble, should have been able to follow easily. But Adair was counting on their pilot's caution. He was right. The Japanese pilots, having just seen one of their numbers shot down in a head-on attack, were suddenly wary of closing to point-blank range with this apparently suicidal American. They began maneuvering for position, trying to set up deflection shots where they could fire at Adair without exposing themselves to his devastating nose-mounted guns. This gave Adair precious seconds. As the P-40 climbed through 10,000 feet, he spotted 2 Oscars trying to position themselves on his tail. He snap-rolled the Warhawk to the right and dove toward them, not away from them, but toward them. The tactic violated every principle of fighter combat. You never dove toward an enemy who had an altitude advantage. But again, the audacity of the move created hesitation. The 2 Oscar pilots scattered, one braking left, one right, to avoid a head-on collision. Adair selected the one braking right and hammered it with a 2-second burst from his machine guns. He saw strikes on the Oscar's wing root and cockpit area. The Japanese fighter's canopy shattered, and the aircraft snap-rolled to the left, out of control. It fell away trailing smoke and debris. 2 down, 8 to go. Adair's radio crackled with voices, Japanese voices. The enemy pilots were communicating, trying to coordinate their attack. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Anger, frustration, and growing determination. They were going to swarm him now, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, making it impossible for him to threaten all of them at once. Part 8. The Gauntlet. The next phase of the battle became a desperate ballet of violence at 300 miles per hour. Adair threw the P-40 into a series of violent maneuvers, not trying to outturn the Oscars, but making himself as difficult to target as possible while simultaneously keeping his nose pointed at threats. An Oscar dove on him from above. Instead of breaking away, Adair pulled up to meet it, firing a long burst. The Oscar's pilot, unnerved by the head-on attack, broke off early. Adair's tracers missed, but the Japanese pilot lost his firing opportunity. Immediately, Adair rolled inverted and pulled through, diving toward another Oscar that was climbing up from below. This pilot was bolder, or perhaps more skilled. He held his course, and both aircraft opened fire simultaneously at 400 yards. It became a deadly game of chicken. Tracers filled the air between the 2 fighters. Something hit Adair's P-40 with a sound like a hammer on an anvil. Once, twice, 3 times. His left wing sprouted holes and he felt the controls go mushy as hydraulic fluid began leaking from damaged lines. But he held his course and kept firing. At 200 yards, the Oscar suddenly staggered in the air. Its engine exploded in a ball of orange flame, and the fighter tumbled past Adair's right wing, missing him by less than 20 feet. 3 down, 7 to go. But Adair's P-40 was hurt. The hydraulic pressure gauge was dropping, which meant his landing gear and flaps might not work when he got back to base, if he got back. His left aileron felt sluggish, probably damaged, and his fuel gauge showed he'd burned through more than half his fuel in the frantic combat maneuvering. Worse, he was getting tired. The constant G-forces from violent maneuvers were exhausting, and you could feel his vision tunneling slightly from the physical strain. His flight suit was soaked with sweat in the tropical heat, and his right hand, gripping the control stick, was starting to cramp. The 7 remaining Oscars regrouped at his altitude, about 12,000 feet now. Adair could see them forming up for a coordinated attack, probably a multi-direction assault that would overwhelm his ability to defend himself. He had perhaps 30 seconds before they attacked. His ammunition counters showed he'd fired about half his available rounds. roughly 10 more seconds of sustained fire if he was careful. The smart move would be to dive for the deck now, use his remaining altitude to build speed, and try to outrun them at low altitude, where the P-40's heavier construction gave it an advantage. But Adair looked at the Oscar formation and made another decision that defied logic. He would attack them again. Part 9. The Breaking Point. Philip Adair advanced his throttle to full military power. There was no war emergency power on the early P-40s, and pointed his damaged Warhawk directly at the center of the Japanese formation. As he closed the distance, he could see the Oscar pilots adjusting their positions, uncertain how to respond to yet another head-on charge. At 1,000 yards, one of the Oscars broke formation and dove toward him, trying to intercept before Adair could threaten the others. Adair ignored him, trusting that the Japanese pilot wouldn't risk a head-on collision, and kept his focus on the main formation. At 600 yards, he opened fire on the two Oscars in the center of the formation. His tracers reached out like probing fingers, and he saw strikes on both aircraft. One Oscar peeled away, trailing smoke. The other seemed undamaged, but broke hard right to escape the incoming fire. The Oscar that had dove to intercept was now behind Adair, perfectly positioned for a killing shot. Tracers streaked past his canopy, and he heard impacts as 12.7mm rounds struck his aircraft. His right wing shuddered, and suddenly his gun sight went dark. Power to the electrical system damaged. Adair snap-rolled left and dove, but the Oscar stayed with him, firing steadily. More hits. He could hear them clanging against the armor plate behind his seat. A round punched through the canopy just inches from his head, spiderwebbing the plexiglass. He pulled up sharply, trading speed for altitude in a desperate attempt to shake his pursuer. The Oscar, lighter and more nimble, should have been able to follow the maneuver easily. But Adair had one advantage the Japanese pilot didn't expect: the P-40's superior structural strength. As he pulled up into a near-vertical climb, Adair continued pulling back on the stick, harder and harder, until the P-40 was on the verge of an accelerated stall. The G-forces crushed him into his seat. 5 Gs, maybe 6. His vision tunneled to a narrow point, and he could feel consciousness trying to slip away. But he held the pull, and at the top of the maneuver, the P-40 stall turned, basically falling over backward in a hammerhead turn. Adair caught a glimpse of the Oscar below him, the Japanese pilot having wisely refused to follow into such a violent maneuver. As the P-40 fell through the stall, nose dropping toward the earth, Adair had a moment, maybe 2 seconds, of perfect positioning. The Oscar was directly in front of him at 300 yards, wallowing in a slow turn. Without a functioning gun sight, Adair aimed using the geometry of his aircraft's nose and the Oscar's position. He pressed the trigger and held it down, firing his remaining ammunition in one sustained burst. The .50 caliber rounds walked across the Oscar's fuselage like the footsteps of an invisible giant. Adair saw the Japanese fighter's canopy explode, then a piece of the wing folded up and tore away. The Oscar snap-rolled violently and went into a flat spin, falling toward the jungle far below. 4 down, 6 to go. But Adair's ammunition was gone. The Browning machine guns had fired their last rounds. All 6 guns were empty. He was defenseless except for the P-40 itself. Nearly 4 tons of metal, fuel, and engine hurtling through the sky at 300 miles per hour. The remaining 6 Oscars were reforming, and their pilots now knew their opponent was out of ammunition. Adair could see them closing in, more confident now, moving to surround him once again. Without guns, he had no way to threaten them, no way to make them hesitate. His fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank remaining, maybe 20 minutes of flying time at his current consumption rate. The hydraulic pressure was nearly zero, which meant his landing gear was definitely not going to work normally. His left aileron was barely responding, making the aircraft want to roll right constantly. And he was at least 40 miles from Mangaldan airfield, with 6 enemy fighters between him and safety. For the first time since the engagement began, Adair allowed himself to consider that he might not survive the next few minutes. But surrender wasn't in his nature, and neither was giving up. If these were his last moments, he would make them count. He nosed the P-40 over into a steep dive, heading for the deck. The Oscars followed, spreading out to cut off any escape route. Adair pushed the dive steeper, watching his airspeed indicator climb past 400 miles per hour, well beyond the P-40's recommended maximum diving speed. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, the damaged left wing flexing alarmingly, but it held together. At 5,000 feet, he pulled out of the dive, feeling the G-forces crush him again. 2 Oscars had stayed with him in the dive, and they were now perfectly positioned on his tail at 400 yards, firing steadily. Tracers streamed past his canopy. Impacts hammered the P-40's fuselage and wings. Adair heard the engine cough once, twice, then catch again. A round must have nicked a fuel line or hit the carburetor. He was running out of options and out of time. Then he saw it. A line of thunderstorms building on the horizon, massive anvil-headed cumulonimbus clouds rising to 30,000 feet, their bases dark and threatening. The storms were maybe 5 miles away, and they offered the only hope of escape he could see. Part 11. Into the Storm. Flying into a tropical thunderstorm was potentially suicidal. The violent updrafts and downdrafts could tear an aircraft apart. Lightning could fry electrical systems. Hail could shatter a canopy or damage control surfaces. Pilots were trained to avoid thunderstorms at all costs. But Adair was out of ammunition. His aircraft was badly damaged, and 6 Japanese fighters were taking turns shooting at him. Death in a thunderstorm seemed preferable to certain death at the hands of the Oscars. He turned toward the storm wall, advancing his throttle as far as it would go. The damaged engine coughed again, but continued running, belching black smoke from the exhaust stacks. Behind him, the Oscars followed, still firing. At 2 miles from the storm, Adair could see rain curtains and lightning flickering in the dark clouds. At 1 mile, he felt the first turbulence, light chop that made the P-40 bounce and shudder. At half a mile, the turbulence became violent, and he had to use both hands on the control stick to keep the aircraft under control. He glanced back and saw that 4 of the 6 Oscars were still following him. The other 2 had apparently decided that chasing one damaged American fighter into a thunderstorm wasn't worth the risk. At the storm's edge, everything went gray. Visibility dropped to 0 as Adair plunged into the rain curtain. The sound of rain hammering on the canopy and fuselage was deafening, drowning out even the roar of the engine. The P-40 began pitching and rolling violently as it encountered the storm's turbulence. Adair fought the controls, trying to keep the wings level and maintain some semblance of straight flight. Without his instruments, the electrical system was damaged and several gauges were no longer working. He had to fly by feel and by watching the angle of the rain streaking across his canopy. A massive updraft grabbed the P-40 and threw it upward like a toy. Adair felt his stomach drop as the aircraft gained 1,000 feet in seconds. Then, just as suddenly, a downdraft hammered him, and the altimeter unwound rapidly as the P-40 fell. He caught a glimpse of one of the Oscars off to his right, also being tossed by the storm's violence. The Japanese pilot was clearly struggling to maintain control. Then, another wall of rain obscured everything, and Adair was alone in a gray world of wind and water. For 5 minutes, though it felt like hours, Adair wrestled with the P-40 as the storm tried to tear it apart. Lightning flashed around him, so close he could smell ozone. Rain found every gap in the canopy and soaked him. The engine continued to run, though it was running rough, missing occasionally as water got into the ignition system. Then, as suddenly as he'd entered it, Adair burst out the other side of the storm. Blue sky and sunshine surrounded him, and the violent turbulence faded to light chop, then smooth air. He looked around frantically, searching for the Oscars. There, 2 of them, emerging from the storm about a mile behind him, both aircraft intact, but clearly rattled by the experience. Of the other 2 that had followed him into the storm, there was no sign. Either they'd turned back, or the storm had claimed them. Part 12. The Long Road Home. 2 enemies were better odds than 6, but Adair was still unarmed, low on fuel, and flying a badly damaged aircraft. He couldn't outrun them in level flight, and he couldn't fight them without ammunition. But the storm had bought him distance and time. The two remaining Oscars were a mile behind, and they seemed to be reforming, perhaps discussing whether to continue the pursuit or return to their base. Adair used those precious seconds to take stock of his situation. His compass was still working, and by the angle of the sun, he estimated he was about 30 miles southeast of Mangaladon, closer than before, but still a long way to go. His fuel gauge showed about 10 minutes of flying time remaining, maybe 15 if he ran the engine lean. The two Oscars made their decision. They turned toward him and began closing the distance, climbing slightly to gain an altitude advantage for their attack. Adair had one card left to play. The Burmese jungle below him was dotted with small villages and patches of cleared land. If he could stay low, flying just above the treetops, the Oscars would have difficulty attacking him from above without risking a collision with the terrain. It would be dangerous flying, especially in a damaged aircraft, but it was his only option. He nosed the P-40 down into a shallow dive, heading for the deck. The jungle rose up to meet him, a green carpet of dense vegetation broken by occasional clearings and narrow rivers. At 500 feet, then 300, then finally at barely 100 feet above the trees, he leveled off. The P-40 was never designed for low-altitude flying in this way, and with the damaged aileron, every correction required constant attention. Adair had to focus completely on avoiding trees, hills, and the occasional tall palm that rose above the jungle canopy. Behind him, the two Oscars followed, but they were clearly uncomfortable with such low-altitude flying. They made several half-hearted attacks, diving down and firing, but they were forced to pull up quickly to avoid the terrain. Their shooting was wild and ineffective. For 10 agonizing minutes, Adair flew just above the jungle canopy, the P-40's propeller occasionally clipping the tops of the tallest trees and sending leaves and small branches flying. His fuel gauge was now reading empty, though he knew there was usually a small reserve that allowed a few more minutes of flight after the gauge hit zero. The engine was running increasingly rough. The temperature gauge, one of the few instruments still working, showed the Allison engine was overheating badly, probably from combat damage to the cooling system. If it seized up, he'd have to crash land in the jungle, and his chances of survival, let alone rescue, would be minimal. The two pursuing Oscars had dropped back slightly, maintaining about half a mile distance. Perhaps they were hoping to simply follow him until his fuel ran out and watch him crash. Perhaps they were low on fuel themselves and considering breaking off the pursuit. Then, ahead on the horizon, Adair saw something that made his heart leap. A column of smoke rising from what looked like an airfield. It had to be Mangaladon. He was almost home. But almost could be a long way when measured in a damaged aircraft with an empty fuel tank and 2 enemy fighters still on your tail. The Oscars saw the airfield too, and they seemed to realize this was their last chance to finish off the stubborn American who had cost them 4 of their comrades. They accelerated and closed the distance, moving into attack position. Adair coaxed every last bit of speed from his dying P-40, keeping it just above the trees. The engine was making terrible grinding sounds now, and he could smell burning oil in the cockpit. The temperature gauge needle was pegged at maximum. At 5 miles from Mangaladon, one of the Oscars made its final attack run, diving from above and slightly to the right. Adair saw it coming and waited until the last possible second, then pulled up sharply, trading his remaining airspeed for altitude. The Oscar, committed to its dive, flashed past beneath him, its burst of machine gun fire tearing through empty air where Adair had been a second before. But the maneuver cost Adair dearly. The P-40, already on the edge of a stall from low airspeed, shuddered and began to fall off on the damaged left wing. He fought at level, but he'd lost precious altitude and speed, and the engine was now coughing continuously, threatening to quit at any moment. The second Oscar was positioning for its attack when suddenly both Japanese fighters broke off and turned away, heading back toward the southeast. At first, Adair couldn't understand why. Then he saw them. 4 P-40s climbing up from Mangaladon, racing to intercept the Oscars before they could make their final attack. The cavalry had arrived, though barely in time. Part 14. Emergency Landing. Adair's relief at seeing the friendly fighters was short-lived. His engine chose that moment to seize completely, the grinding sound suddenly replaced by ominous silence except for the whistle of wind over the damaged airframe. He was now flying a glider, a very heavy, very badly damaged glider. Mangaladon Airfield was 3 miles ahead, but he was at only 400 feet altitude and descending. He ran through his landing checklist by memory. Landing gear. Hydraulics were out, so he'd have to manually crank down the gear, assuming the mechanism wasn't damaged. Flaps. Same problem, probably not available. Fuel mixture. Irrelevant with a dead engine. Magnetos. Off. He grabbed the manual landing gear crank and began turning it, feeling resistance that suggested the mechanism was at least partially functional. After 20 cranks, he felt something lock into place. He looked out the side of the canopy and saw his right main gear was down, but he couldn't see the left side to confirm. The airfield was 2 miles ahead now, and he was at 300 feet, still descending at about 200 feet per minute. He'd have one chance to get this right. Without engine power, he couldn't go around for a second attempt. At 1 mile out, he was at 200 feet. The runway, a dirt strip with pierced steel planking laid down the center, was clearly visible ahead. Ground crews and other pilots were running out to watch, having heard the alert that one of their own was coming in on a dead engine with battle damage. At half a mile, Adair was at 100 feet and could see he was going to make it to the airfield, but whether he'd reach the runway itself was uncertain. He was descending faster now, the P-40 trading altitude for airspeed to maintain flying speed. The boundary fence of the airfield passed beneath him at 50 feet. The runway threshold was ahead, marked by white painted stones. He eased back on the stick, trying to stretch his glide just a little farther, but not so much that he'd stall the aircraft completely. The P-40's main wheels touched the ground 20 feet short of the runway, hitting the dirt with a jarring impact that threw Adair forward against his shoulder harness. The aircraft bounced back into the air, and for a heart-stopping moment, he thought he'd lost too much airspeed and would stall. But the Warhawk settled back down, this time on the runway proper. Without hydraulic pressure, he had no brakes. The P-40 rolled down the runway, gradually slowing but still moving at 40 miles per hour as it approached the far end. Adair stood on the rudder pedals, using what little steering he had available, and managed to ground loop the aircraft, deliberately spinning it around in a circle that scrubbed off the remaining speed. The P-40 finally shuddered to a stop, ending up pointed back the way it had come, 50 feet from the end of the runway. For a long moment, Adair sat in the cockpit, his hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline, unable to quite believe he was still alive. Part 15. The Aftermath. Ground crews and pilots reached the aircraft within seconds, swarming around it to check for fire and help Adair from the cockpit. When he tried to stand, his legs nearly gave out, and 2 mechanics had to support him as he climbed down from the wing. Squadron leader Robert Smith was there, his face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Adair! We thought you were done for when we saw you coming in on a dead stick with those 2 Oscars on your tail. What the hell happened up there?" Adair opened his mouth to answer, but found his throat was too dry to speak. Someone handed him a canteen, and he drank deeply before trying again. "Got separated from the formation after the bomber attack. Ran into 10 Oscars. We had a disagreement about who owned that piece of sky." 10? Another pilot asked incredulously. "You fought 10 Oscars alone?" "Didn't have much choice," Adair replied, his voice hoarse. "They kind of insisted." By now, more pilots and ground crew had gathered, and they were examining Adair's P-40 with amazement. The aircraft looked like it had been through a metal shredder. They counted over 100 bullet and cannon holes in the fuselage and wings. The left aileron was hanging by a thread, nearly shot away. The right wing had a hole large enough to put a fist through. The engine was destroyed, with at least 3 cylinders cracked from bullet impacts. The hydraulic lines were shredded. The canopy had 7 separate bullet holes. "Jesus, Lieutenant," one of the mechanics breathed. "I don't know how this thing stayed in the air. You should be dead."
One of the other pilots who'd been on the morning mission spoke up. "We were regrouping after the bomber attack when we heard on the radio, Japanese chatter, lots of it, all excited. Then we heard someone call for help, ask for top cover on the route back. We figured it was one of ours in trouble, so 4 of us headed out. That's when we saw you, coming in at treetop level with those 2 on your tail." "Did you confirm any kills?" Smith asked. "Your gun camera footage might show something, if the camera survived." Adair thought back through the frantic minutes of combat. "I got 4 of them for sure. Saw all 4 go down. Maybe 1 or 2 more damaged. I hit several others but didn't see them crash." The gun camera had indeed survived, protected by its armored housing. Later that afternoon, after Adair had been checked by the flight surgeon, debriefed by intelligence officers, and allowed to clean up and eat something, the film was developed and reviewed. The flickering black and white footage confirmed Adair's account. The intelligence officer, a British RAF squadron leader named Pemberton, watched the film 3 times before he spoke. "Extraordinary! Absolutely extraordinary! I count 4 confirmed kills, all clearly visible in the camera footage. The first one broke apart after you hit it head-on. The second went into a spin, trailing smoke. The third exploded. You must have hit its fuel tank. The fourth lost most of its wing." He paused the projector and turned to Adair. "Lieutenant, I've been analyzing combat footage for 2 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this. You attacked them. You attacked a formation of 10 enemy fighters while you were alone and outnumbered. That goes against every tactical doctrine we teach." Adair shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "Running wasn't working. They had me boxed in. I figured if I was going to go down, I might as well take some of them with me." "It was more than that," interjected Claire Chennault, who had arrived from Kunming after hearing about the engagement. The grizzled AVG commander studied the younger pilot with his sharp, calculating eyes. "You understood something in that moment that most pilots never learn. Sometimes the most aggressive action is the safest action. They expected you to run, and you did the opposite. It created hesitation, confusion. That's what kept you alive." Chennault turned to address the other pilots who had gathered in the briefing room. "Gentlemen, what Lieutenant Adair did today should not be standard procedure. You should not charge into 10 enemy fighters alone. But you should understand the principle. Aggression, used at the right moment in the right way, can overcome numerical superiority. The Japanese pilots are skilled and brave, but they follow doctrine rigidly. When someone does something completely unexpected, it disrupts their coordination." Over the next few days, word of Adair's engagement spread throughout the Allied air forces in Burma and China. The story grew with each retelling. Some versions had him facing 15 enemy fighters. Others had him shooting down 6 or 7. But the core facts remained: 1 pilot, 1 aircraft, 10 enemy fighters, 4 confirmed victories, and a miraculous survival. The Chinese nationalist government, which had hired the AVG specifically to defend the Burma Road and support Chinese forces, was particularly pleased. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek personally sent a commendation to Adair, along with a ceremonial sword. The British colonial authorities in Burma, struggling to maintain control of Rangoon, also recognized Adair's achievement with official citations. In the weeks following, American and British intelligence officers conducted extensive debriefings with Adair, trying to understand exactly how he had survived and what lessons could be extracted for other pilots. Several key points emerged from this analysis. First, Adair's decision to attack rather than flee had been counterintuitive but effective, specifically because it was unexpected. The Japanese pilots had positioned themselves to intercept his escape, not to defend against an attack. When he charged into their formation, it disrupted their tactical plan and forced them to react individually rather than as a coordinated unit. Second, the head-on attack proved devastatingly effective against the Oscar fighters. The Ki-43 was lightly built to maximize maneuverability and climb rate, which made it vulnerable to the P-40's heavy 50 caliber guns. In contrast, the P-40's rugged construction and armor plating allowed it to absorb significant battle damage, as evidenced by the more than 100 hits Adair's aircraft took, and still remain flyable. Third, Adair had exploited the P-40's superior diving speed and structural strength repeatedly during the engagement.
Every time he needed to break contact or reposition, he dove. The Oscars could follow initially, but they couldn't match the P-40's dive speed, and their lighter construction meant their pilots had to be more cautious about overstressing the airframe. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Adair had maintained situational awareness throughout the engagement. Despite being outnumbered and under constant attack, he had kept track of enemy positions, monitored his fuel and ammunition, assessed his damage, and planned his escape route. This level of tactical awareness under extreme stress was the mark of an exceptional combat pilot. Philip Adair's damaged P-40 was eventually repaired and returned to service, though it took nearly 3 weeks of work.
Adair himself was back in the air within days, flying a replacement aircraft. He would go on to score several more victories before the Flying Tigers were disbanded in July 1942 and reorganized as the 23rd Fighter Group of the United States Army Air Forces. The engagement on January 24, 1942, became one of the most studied aerial combats of the early war period. It appeared in training materials, was discussed in tactical briefings, and became part of the legend of the Flying Tigers. Military historians would later cite it as a textbook example of how a skilled pilot in an inferior aircraft could overcome overwhelming odds through aggressive tactics, tactical awareness, and sheer determination. But for Adair himself, the engagement remained a deeply personal memory, not of glory or heroism, but of desperate choices made in desperate circumstances. In interviews conducted decades later, he was characteristically modest about his achievement. "I did what I had to do to survive," he would say. "Any other pilot in the same situation would have done the same thing. I just happened to get lucky." Yet those who flew with him knew it was more than luck. It was skill, courage, and split-second decision-making under the most extreme pressure imaginable. On that January morning over Burma, when 10 Japanese fighters attacked one P-40, Philip Adair made a decision that defied logic and doctrine. And that decision not only saved his life, but left everyone who heard the story speechless. The legacy of that engagement lived on long after the war ended. It reminded generations of military aviators that numerical superiority doesn't guarantee victory, that aggressive action can sometimes be the best defense, and that one determined individual, even when facing impossible odds, can make a difference. Philip Adair's decision that day became more than just a story of survival. It became a testament to the courage and ingenuity of the pilots who fought in the skies over Asia during World War II.
Historical note: Philip Adair survived the war, and the engagement described here represents one of the most remarkable single-pilot actions of the Flying Tigers campaign in Burma. The tactics he employed that day, particularly the use of head-on attacks against numerically superior forces, would influence fighter tactics throughout the Pacific War. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, despite its limitations, proved itself as a rugged and deadly fighter in the hands of skilled pilots like Adair, and the Flying Tiger's success in China and Burma provided a crucial morale boost to Allied forces during the darkest days of early 1942.